Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I've been listening to the debate on the budget today, and I think it's important that, you know, we raise some issues with, you know, the statistics that the government's using and the messages that they're coming out with. Because when I go back to my constituency just outside of Edmonton, Alberta, and I knock on doors and I talk to people at their homes or meet them at their business, what I hear from them about how they're feeling about this economy and how it's impacting their personal lives, it doesn't match up with the rhetoric that's coming out of this government. Recent reports have it that many families in Canada are $200 away from insolvency, from paying their bills at the end of the month. And that is the reality in my constituency, Mr. Speaker. We have people in my constituency who are making the choice this month between paying their car payment and heating their homes. And many people in my riding have already lost their homes because of the downturn in the energy sector, because we have failed, this government has failed to get pipelines built to new markets so that we can get an equitable and fair price for our excellent energy resources, and families are suffering. And I go and I'm door knocking down the street, and there are so many for sale signs. One neighborhood in one cul-de-sac, I had 4 out of 8 houses that were up for sale, and these houses haven't moved for months, Mr. Speaker. And people are cutting the price, and they're cutting the price, and they're losing money. They're losing money because they don't have jobs, and there's nobody who's buying these houses, Mr. Speaker. So the reality that this government talks about is not the reality that we're seeing in our communities, especially in Alberta. Now, let's talk about this 1 million jobs that this government's talking about, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about 1 million jobs, and when we look at immigration statistics, I read the report from the immigration minister every year, and it's wonderful that our country is bringing in so many great permanent residents and new Canadians who can contribute to our economy. But we're bringing in, on average, more than 250,000 people every year, people that we need for our economy. And we brought in 250,000 every year for the past 4 years. That's 1 million people. That's 1 million people that need jobs, Mr. Speaker, and that's not even counting the Canadians who are turning 18 every year who also need jobs. So when we're talking about 1 million new jobs, well, we've had over 1 million new Canadians needing jobs, Mr. Speaker. So we need this government to be more robust in job creation. 1 million jobs is just the baseline level that we need to actually sustain our economy. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about GDP per capita, Mr. Speaker, we're actually seeing it begin to go down, Mr. Speaker, because they're not creating enough jobs. These are not high-paying jobs, Mr. Speaker. We have more and more people who have worked their whole lives, and they've done great jobs. People like my grandmother, who still works as a nurse at the age of 71, who is proud and happy to work. But these people, the baby boomer generation, is beginning to retire. And we're seeing a demographic shift in this country that immigration is doing a lot to help, but we're just seeing a huge demographic shift in this country where the amount of working age people to retired people is shrinking. And when we have that, Mr. Speaker, we're having that in this country, combined with a government that is running bigger and bigger deficits, Mr. Speaker, with no plan to deal with this shrinking workforce, then we are headed to an economic disaster. Now, this government promised that they would run sustainable deficits, that they would be deficits of no more than $10 billion a year, and in 4 years, they would bring a balanced budget. Well, we're here this year, Mr. Speaker, and the report that came out today from Finance Canada is that the government spent $15 billion in the month of March alone, March Madness, Mr. Speaker. Like, how is this sustainable government spending? And so we're facing at least a $15 billion deficit this year, and that's far beyond what the government promised to do, and it's certainly not anywhere close to getting a balanced budget. So when we have numbers like this, Mr. Speaker, how are we being prepared for the economy of the future, where our workers are increasingly getting older, and where we're not seeing the kind of productivity gains that we need to see as a country in order to sustain ourselves going into the future? Now, we're looking at places like Calgary. Recent stories have come out where over the past 4 years, now this isn't the federal government's responsibility, but we're seeing property taxes have gone up for business owners by 99% in the last 4 years. Now, that's because the entire energy sector in Alberta has been decimated, and so the government at the city level needs to increase taxes, and they're doing this. They're not cutting spending, and more businesses are shutting down. We're seeing small retailers in Edmonton and in Calgary having to shut down because they can't sustain their operations. And we have a federal government here that isn't looking at a holistic picture of our economy. They're not looking at where our provincial governments are, where our municipal governments are, and seeing that taxes are going up at provincial levels and at municipal levels, and instead they've decided to pile on their own layer of taxes. We have new carbon taxes, Mr. Speaker. We have new taxes on small business owners, on their passive income, on their savings. And we're having, a significant increase in payroll taxes, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing an increase in the amount of money that people need to pay into their CPP and that employers need to pay into their CPP. And this is having a stunting effect on wage growth in this country, Mr. Speaker. When you look at our neighbor to the south, usually when the United States economy is doing well, and which it is now, it's over 3% annualized growth, we could expect the Canadian economy to pick up in a similar way. But we're seeing our economy annualized growth of 0.4%. It's pathetic, Mr. Speaker. It's barely above inflation. And we're seeing that, Canadian savings, they're not being able to keep up. Their wage growth is not being able to keep up with the increased cost of living, not just from inflation, but from this government's increased taxes. Now, when I was door knocking on last Saturday in my constituency, I ran across a family, and the first thing they said to me is, Dane, why did this government, why did these Liberals get rid of tax splitting for families, and why did they get rid of our children's arts and fitness tax credit? That paid for my daughter to go to dance. These were things. So the government talks about the Canada Child Benefit, and the Canada Child Benefit is an important program. It builds upon the universal childcare benefit that our previous Conservative government created. But when they talk about how they increased all this money to families, well, they're not talking about where this money came from. Where did it come from, Mr. Speaker? It came from gutting children's fitness and arts tax credits. It came from getting rid of family tax income splitting. It came from lowering the amount of money that families could save on their own through the TFSA when they lowered it from $10,000 to $5,000. Madam Speaker. So they're increasing taxes on the one hand on families by getting rid of tax credits that middle-class families and lower-class families were using, and then they're giving them money through an increased government program. It's not increased benefits, it's increasing benefits and increasing taxes. It's just a shell game, Mr. Speaker. And now I want to talk about, this so-called tax increase on the 1%, the wealthiest 1%. Well, the misconception and the falsehood behind that argument is that it's not a tax on the wealthiest 1%. It's a tax on the 1% of highest earners. And so there's a huge difference when we're talking about the 1% of highest earners and the 1% of wealthy. Because as today, we've seen that KPMG just made a deal with the CRA so that the true wealthiest 1% of this country got a huge tax deal from the CRA. So when we see what the impact, what the government's actions are on the wealthiest 1%, well, truly, it's when the CRA is making deals with KPMG for the actual 1%. People who have intergenerational wealth built up through generations and generations who really pay very little income taxes because they don't, frankly, need to work. But what families are we talking about when we're talking about the wealthiest 1% or the highest 1% of income earners? Well, we're talking about recent medical graduates, dental graduates, lawyers, people who go hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in order to get skills that our society needs, skills that are highly valued in our society and that pay well. And these people are often getting out of school with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, especially if they have to go to the United States to go to school. And they're coming back to Canada and they're working for a few years and they're getting up to that high income level. And this government's saying, you're the wealthiest 1%, you need to pay more income taxes, Mr. Speaker. Instead of targeting those people, we should be trying to bring those people to Canada, Mr. Speaker, encouraging those people to stay here and practice here, Mr. Speaker, and instead going after the actual wealthiest 1%, Mr. Speaker, the people who are hiding their money offshore, who are getting deals from the CRA, Mr. Speaker. Like, that is the wealthiest 1%, and that is the wealthiest 1% that this government will never actually touch because they're focused on playing class warfare politics with Canadians. And then we're talking about, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see it's done.
Sorry, I didn't mean for him to trail off on the end there. I just want to say his time was coming up. He has about 10 seconds left, if he'd like to finish his 10 seconds.
Well, I just realized that we did get a new speaker in the chair today, and I must say that the chair has never looked so great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's have a vote.
I sincerely thank you for the support. There's been no coup. I can assure all the members of that. Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments.
We're from... Yes, from somewhere. Beach. Burnaby, yes, Burnaby to Seymour. Thank you very much.
I listened closely to my friend's opposite speech, and you're doing an excellent job, by the way, Mr. Speaker, up there. He was talking a lot about deficits and debt, so I did some quick Googling just to make sure my numbers are right. The previous Conservative government rang up over $150 billion worth of debt. The previous Conservative government before that rang up $330 billion worth of debt. If you add that up, that's $490 billion, just the last two Conservative prime ministers. So Canada's been around for 152 years, Mr. Speaker, and the last two Conservative prime ministers account for 72% of the total debt. Why do we think they're going to do any different in 2019?
Good question.
The honourable member from Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when we have to look at the context of these things. In the 1980s, when the Brian Mulroney government was in power, they were handed a stagnant economy, inflation rates were in the double digits, interest rates were in the double digits, and they were left a huge mess by the previous Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. And so when we did the Brian Mulroney government did the tangible actions to get our fiscal house in order, who benefited from that, Mr. Speaker? Well, it was the Chrétien government that benefited from that. We did the hard work, and then you know what they did? They just cut, and gave it to the provinces to deal with, took no responsibility, Mr. Speaker, and that's not a responsible way of doing things.
Questions and comments. The honourable member from Fleetwood Port Kells.
It was interesting to hear the honourable member bring up the issue of income splitting, because that is something that the Conservative government put forward prior to the last election. Interesting to note that an analysis done on income splitting of the type that they were advocating said that the primary beneficiaries, 98% of the benefits would go to families where you had a single wage earner earning over $150,000 a year. Guess where most of those folks are? Alberta. And it seems that there's been quite an Alberta-centric vision that the Conservative Party has had for quite some time. Remember the energy superpark. Heck, remember last week when the leader of the opposition was out again promoting Alberta oil from coast to coast to coast. But the key question I have for my honourable member across the way is, like the other Conservative measures, are we going to go back to the future? Is his party going to put forward the notion of income splitting for all families in Canada again?
Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will never apologize for standing up for my constituents, the people of Alberta. Not now and not ever. And when we look, it's ironic that the member brought up, that 98% of the families that would benefit were making $150,000 and more, when it was the government's own so-called middle class tax cut that benefited people making $90,000 and over, Mr. Speaker. That was the people that benefited the most. And, our previous government, took into account that, an unlimited tax splitting tax scheme would have a disproportionate effect on the wealthier people over the younger people, or less wealthy people. So we put in a maximum. That was only a maximum of $5,000 that families could benefit from income splitting. Now, if the member is against income splitting, I hope that maybe they'll answer, are they going to take away income splitting for pensioners and seniors?
I have time for one more short question and response. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
My honourable colleague, I'm curious if you truly understand how the unemployment rate system works. He talked about immigration being that only new Canadians were the ones that got jobs. Can he actually understand that the fact that the unemployment rate has increased and that he doesn't fully understand how this system works, which also is consistent with Conservatives who don't really understand how the economy works, and therefore when he refers to stats in this House, he simply has zero comprehension of it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I don't appreciate when the member is gaslighting people of this chamber on what I had previously stated, Mr. Speaker. I never said that only the immigrants were getting jobs. I'm saying if we bring in 1 million people, which I strongly support immigration, if they're only providing 1 million new jobs, then that's only enough to provide for those people. And we have many people who are coming of age in this country who also need jobs, and so they're not being covered as well. And, you know, I didn't see the member there when I was speaking, so I'm not sure if she understood exactly what I was saying, and it's clear that that was the case. Thank you.